And the room is filling up quickly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. I'm Elisa, and I'm an event staffer at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I would like to welcome you to PNP Live. We appreciate you joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we've been working hard to bring you the authors that you love and their new books to our PNP community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Who's Black and Why on the Politics and Prose website. If you look near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. You can click there to submit a question to the authors, and while we try our best to get to everyone's questions, we do apologize in advance if we run out of time before we get to yours. We'll also be providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box right at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, I would like to say thank you again for being here. We're immensely grateful for you all helping keep our business and our spirits afloat. And now, I'd like to welcome to PNP Live, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Andrew Curran celebrating the release of their book, Who's Black and Why? A Hidden Chapter from the 18th Century Invention of Race. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the author of numerous books and has written extensively on the history of race and anti-Black racism in the Enlightenment. His most recent work includes Stony, the Road, and the Black Church. He's the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Andrew S. Curran is the leading specialist on the Enlightenment era and the author of The Anatomy of Blackness and Jitterow and the Art of Thinking Freely. He's the William Armstrong Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University. Gates and Curran will be in conversation with Celeste Headlee. Headlee is an award-winning journalist and professional speaker and is the best-selling author of We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. She's the co-host of the new weekly series Retro Report on PBS and season 3 of the Scene on Radio podcast. Who's Black and Why is the first translation and publication of 16 submissions to the notorious 18th century Bordeaux essay contest on the cause of Black skin, an indispensable chronicle of the rise of scientifically based anti-Black racism. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Henry Louis Gates Jr., Andrew Curran, and Celeste Headlee to PNP Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a lovely introduction.
It was lovely. I feel like we've all kind of gotten used to these odd Zoom book events in which it's silent on our end, right? We're just staring into a camera eye. There is a lot to get through tonight, so I want to jump right in. You know, this book was difficult for me to read, to get through. And not difficult in that I had to take it a little bit at a time. And I wanted to start with you both from the beginning in terms of when you discovered this material, how did you decide what to do with it?
Well, I first heard about the essay competition from one of our staff members, Karen Dalton, who is the executive director of our Image of the Black and Western Art project, which is housed at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, over which I'm the director. And I'm also the co-editor with the art historian David Beinman of the now 11-volume Image of the Black and Western Art. And about a decade or so ago, Karen came to me and said, there was this, it was unbelievable, Celeste, that there was an essay competition at the height of the Enlightenment on the causes of the Blackness of the African. 16 essays were submitted from as far away as Sweden and Ireland and of course France, and they were written in Latin and in French. They were submitted over the next 2 years between 1739 and 1741. And then the 40 academicians met and argued and didn't award the prize, which was a gold medal and the equivalent of a year's salary for a worker in France. And then she said, all these essays have just sat in the archives for almost 300 years. Now, you know that just lit me on fire. This is like the Dead Sea Scrolls of Blackness, you know? And I said, deal. She said, will you do this with me? I go, are you crazy? Let's do it. And unfortunately, she had a stroke. She recovered from the stroke, but she was not able to continue with the work. And so it was sort of hanging there. And I was reading, I didn't know Andy, but I was reading his book, Anatomy of Blackness. And there was a special issue of an academic journal with people responding to his work, which is a sign of how seminal his work truly is. And in his book, he has footnotes. I mean, he talks about some of these essays. And so I reached out to him. I just said, you don't know me, but I'm an 18th century man, and my PhD dissertation at Cambridge way back in 1978 was all about race and the Enlightenment. And I've written about it ever since in different ways. And I said, I need a partner. Would you partner with me? He said, deal. And so then I pitched my friends at Harvard University Press, and here we are today.
Andy, could you explain this practice that we don't really have anymore of these essay contests where anybody in the world could submit? What can you give us a little bit more of the context and the history of this type of thing?
Yeah, I think first thing we have to do is contrast two different kind of institutions at the time: universities and academies. This is a scientific academy, and universities in the 18th century and 17th century were places that replicated knowledge. They produced lawyers, doctors, and theologians, priests. They were not in the business of creating new knowledge. They were in the business of kind of just replicating knowledge and creating these professions. And essentially, they're almost vocational schools. And to the side were these scientific academies that popped up in the United States. Think about the American Philosophical Society and the New York Academy of Medicine. There's various academies that pop up all over the place, but primarily, in Europe. And there's the Paris Academy of Sciences, and then there's the Board of Academy of Sciences. These things all really kind of took shape in the late 17th and early 18th century. And they were designed to be humanist institutions, places that really replicated and embodied Enlightenment thought, progress, rationality, science, to a certain extent, empiricism. And in order to get their names out, they created these competitions or prize puzzles. And they would publish these in scientific journals, and they would go out all over Europe. And remember that France is the biggest country in Europe. Hard to imagine, 25 million people. That's a huge country in the 18th century. There's about, 1 million people in North America. We're talking about colonists and enslaved peoples, 5, 6, 7 million people in England, 7 million in Spain. France is a huge country. And so it is the kind of the cultural and institutional and scientific crossroads for a lot of ideas. And so these call for papers went out all over the place. And as Skip was saying, they would get essays from Ireland, from Sweden, and there was even people in North America who were thinking about this contest. There's a guy in Virginia associated with the plantation who wrote some friends in London about that. So word got out.
So I wanted to read something that for those who don't.
Celeste,
Yeah.
This is the first time any academy set as the subject of the competition to explain the physical characteristics of a whole group of people. The first time. So this shows that what was percolating in their heads with, why are these Africans black? Why is their hair curly? Where does this come from? So they, isn't that amazing?
And the answers they give, boggle the mind. Not surprising, but just anyhow. I wanted to
listen. I made a summary for you. Can I do this just for our friends?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Blackness is God's plan. 3 essays. Blackness is a result of the maternal imagination. I'm going to come back to that. 3 essays.
Oh God, you have to come back to that.
It's so hilarious. Blackness is a moral fault. 1. Blackness is a result of climate. 8. Right? Because, black people live near the equator and that turn their skin black. Blackness is a result of medical problems or conditions, physiological conditions. 6. Being black is reversible. One guy says his grandfather was black and he moved out of Africa, then, gradually the blackness would disappear. That cracks me up. And then 3 said blackness is a result of species degeneration from an original whiteness. That the original Adam and Eve were white and blackness is a falling away. Nobody knew that, as it were, the original Adam and Eve were black. There were people in what is now Ethiopia, northern Kenya. Ironically, it's the other way around. But okay, so let me read this 2-paragraph summary. There's a lot of disagreement about where Africans where the blackness of Africans came from. Some religious thinkers maintain that either Adam or Eve was black, that there were separate Adam and Eve. It's called polygenesis, right? Others said the black skin was a mark of God denoting sinfulness. A number claim that God made the original people white, but this original group had degenerated into black people due to either brutal climate, poor food, or bad air. 2 more maintain that blackness was a God-given gift to allow people to live in the torrid zone, which is near the equator. One of the more earnest authors lamented the fact that black Africans had a moral defect in their parents, which led their children to be black. And then there were early quote unquote scientific explanations. One author stated flatly that Africans had black semen. Several mentioned that the fact that blackness results from the blood, black blood, and that Africans have darker blood due to the effect of air. Another anatomist claimed that Africans had a special black bile circulating in their bodies or were the product of that black sperm of the father. But my absolute favorite is that white women produce black children when they're thinking about an African man while they were having sex, or the color black during the sex act. You know, this is wild.
Or looking at a picture. Yeah, that's maternal imagination, which is insane, and also makes you wonder what the wife had told them when if the baby came out black.
That's true. Now, the essays 4, 5, 6, 12, 14, and 15 all refute the curse of Ham. Now, for those of you who don't know, even when I was growing up, just up the river, you know, near Cumberland, Maryland, across Piedmont, West Virginia, all kind of people believed the biblical explanation for the curse of that blackness was a curse. And it was a curse because Ham looked upon his father Noah's nakedness when Noah got drunk. And unlike his 2 brothers who shielded their eyes, Ham looked upon his father's nakedness and mocked him. And so God put a curse on Ham through his son Canaan, and that Canaan would be a servant unto servants. And this became conflated over time with the curse of blackness. But this is what essayist number 2 says. And there is it's kind of an adaptation of it. He says, there's a well-accepted tradition among the Ethiopian people that claims that, in fact, they owed their origin to Ham, son of Noah, through their parents and ancestors, all the way back to the first progenitors, almost as if transmitted by word of mouth. I'm quoting from the essay, of course. In particular, Ethiopian priests add the following, that Noah had 3 sons, one white, the second brown, and the third black, that the wives of each of them imparted to their progeny the same color as their husbands, so that the wife who coupled with her equally black husband gave birth to black Ethiopians. Now, he says we should note that Hebrew proper names often have meanings. The word Ham, the name of one of Noah's sons, also means hot or burnt, and by analogy denotes black. The name Ham probably reflects the color of his parents. Secondly, both lay and religious authors involved in these studies derive the origin of the Ethiopians to Cush, the son of Ham. And Cush means, and the Cushites, you know, the kingdom of Cush, it was Nubia in what is today Sudan. And Cush means the land of the blacks, like Sudan means land of the blacks. Zanzibar means the land of the blacks. Nigeria, of course, literally means blackness. And Niger also is Latin for blackness. So it's clear that in Ethiopia means the land of the burnt face.
Burnt face, yeah.
Right. And Abyssinia, land of the mixed race. So it's clear that the most striking thing to non-Africans about Africans was the color of their skin and the fact that they called them hyperbolically black, because nobody's black. You know, our people, our ancestors from the continent are various shades of brown, but they were called black in contradistinction within a binary opposition to quote unquote white people, and nobody's white either. And you could look at Andy, the only thing white about Andy is his shirt.
It's true. It's true. And the shelves in the background.
Yeah, that's right.
But I wanted to read something from the introduction. For those who don't have the book yet, there's a lengthy introduction, and then they have commentary and separate essays that come after. So I wanted to read.
Celeste, a lengthy, highly readable introduction.
Oh, it's extremely enjoyable. I'm assuming everybody's here because they're interested in the subject matter. So I wanted to read this passage where you said, seemingly trapped in amber, the essays submitted to the Academy constitute the rarest of treasures, a sui generis artifact in the history of ideas, a set of texts that, taken together, help us understand the larger context in which the concept of race took shape.
That's right.
So tell me about this sui generis, this that you believe this is a time at which the entire idea of race was invented.
That's right. As Andy points out, Francois Bernier was the first person to use the word race in 1684. And before that, and continuing after that, people use phrases like species of man, varieties, national character, nation, or people. But Bernier didn't establish a cultural hierarchy between the so-called races. That would only come after the middle of the 18th century. And it begins, we see it with David Hume. David Hume wrote an essay of national characters in 1748, and he talked about basically all the world's peoples, within limits, right? Except the Africans. So somebody probably gave him flack about that because he published a second edition in 1753 in which he has Celeste a footnote about Black people. A footnote. It is so cold and it is so nasty. I'm going to read it to you. He says, this is the whole footnote. I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds. He didn't mean that there were different colored people descended from the proverbial Adam and Eve. He meant there were 4 or 5 different kinds. So polygenesis, we call it. And okay, I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, or even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature, and that's key because if nature does it, you can't change it, right? If nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. Not to mention our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of whom none ever discovered any symptom of ingenuity. That is so cool. Though low people without education will start up or rise up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, he concludes, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning. And here he's talking about a man who actually existed, named Francis Williams, who studied law in London, came back, founded a school. He was free. His father was wealthy. And Celeste, he published poetry in Latin. So Hume says, in Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but 'tis likely he's admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. Whoa, that's cool. And then 11 years later, Immanuel Kant, who would go on to write Critique of Pure Reason, in a riff, he's saying, I'm riffing on David Hume's essay of national characters. It's in 1764 in a book called Observation on the Beautiful and Sublime, is the first person to conflate. There have been a lot of people, as Andy likes to point out to me, who had trashed Black people in Africa. But Kant was the very first person who conflated character with characteristics, a physical characteristic. And he says that what one Black man had to say, he's quoted by a French writer, a priest. He said, what one Black man had to say, it could have been interesting or could have been intelligent. He said, however, the man was Black from head to toe, a clear proof of what he had to say was stupid, a clear proof that what he had to say was stupid. There, for the first time in my scholarship, we have someone saying, if you see a Black face, whatever comes out of their mouth is going to be stupid because Blackness connotes stupidity. And that means, if you're Black, you can't get out of this trap of being stupid, right? Because all Black people are stupid. Blackness itself is a sign of stupidity. That is 1753 for Hume, 1764 for Kant. And then Kant will go on in an essay in 1755, using these categories of race, but assigning values to them, which put our ancestors from Africa, boom, and a permanent low point on the great chain of being. Andy, did I get all that right, my brother?
You got it all, of course you did. So I was just going to add a couple of things about 1741, jumping back to the contest itself. This is really a critical moment, as Skip was saying, in that the scientific institution is claiming the right to decide what race is. And all the terms that Skip was talking about, variety and nation and genre in French, these are slowly being replaced by the notion of race. And particularly, there's one word, variety, which is the one kind of scientific term. So Linnaeus and Buffon, who comes a couple of years after the contest, talk about human varieties. Blumenbach talks about varieties as well. And varieties is an interesting term to use to talk about humans. In fact, it's preferable to race because it implies hybridization. It implies kind of a botanical kind of notion where things kind of change over time and millions of different varieties. Whereas the term race, which starts to crystallize and come into use much more kind of often in the 1750s, is a zoological idea. It's something which used to be associated with kings and dogs and bloodlines. And once you start taking categories and associating categories, traits with bloodlines, that's one of the things that allows the kind of horrific actual racism that's taking place in Hume and Kant later on. It's the idea that there's a destiny associated with the biology, heredity, biology, and then all the horrible things we're talking about. And classification is super important too, because classification with Kant allows people to have an infrastructure for organizing all the xenophobia in a way that's very understandable into categories. That's the final nail in the coffin.
It is.
So,
and Celeste, what's happening, this contest has a context, and the context is called slavery. It is called race-based slavery. It is called the African slave trade. It is called the transatlantic slave trade. And they're trying to justify, without ever saying it, why these Africans are so different that Europeans should be able to sleep at night and not have their consciences sullied by this horrendous slave trade. Remember, between 1501 and 1866, 12.5 million Africans would be shipped across the Atlantic. 12.5 million, 15% die in the Middle Passage, 10.7 million get off the boats. It is the greatest mass migration force in human history. And it is dire and nasty, and Europeans, even in the Great Enlightenment, the pursuit of beauty and truth with a capital B and capital T, the greatest figures in the Enlightenment, Hume, Kant, were even Voltaire and Montesquieu, who were anti-slavery, still said derisive things about people of African descent.
So, but I'm glad you brought this up, because I want to talk about the conversation that was happening in Europe around this contest that these essays were submitted for. And I'm going to read from the book again. By the way, I'm seeing things coming over chat, by the way, for our viewers. If you have an actual question that you want to have asked to the panelists, please put it in the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see it says Q&A. Please put it there, because we won't read questions from the chat. But I want to read this thing. You say, the idea of what would soon come to be known as race was the product of an expansive European conversation occurring in prestigious national academies, anatomy theaters, royal palaces, as well as in the more informed environment of the public cafe. And you take note of the fact that at this point we get the first Enlightenment thinker to actually condemn slavery. So I wondered if both of you could talk a little bit about this conversation that was happening in Europe at the time and how it was going. Mm-hmm. Andy, do you want to start? Oh, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Andy.
Sure. Well, it's true that I think before 1740, people were not actually interested as much in what we would call proto-anthropology or even the slave trade. So when you think about Diderot's encyclopedia, for example, Diderot is working on the encyclopedia in the 1750s, et cetera, and Africa and these anthropological concerns were really not at the forefront of what they were interested in doing. They were talking mainly about God getting rid of God, scientific methodology, reason and progress, all the things we associate with Enlightenment. But after 1740s and 1750s, there's a really seismic shift. And part of it has to do with literacy as well. More and more people are writing, and then more and more contacts are taking place between Africans and non-Europeans and Europeans. To go back to the slave trade for a second, it's interesting to think about Bordeaux as a typical example. Bordeaux is a great microcosm and also allows us to look at everything else at the same time because it's such an important port. It's the biggest port in France by 1750. In 1728, Bordeaux only sent out 10 slave trading expeditions, and it doesn't become a huge slave trader until much later in the century. But by the time the contest is happening, they're transporting 2,000 enslaved Africans to the New World. By 1780s, it's up to between 4,000 and 8,000 a year. So it's an enormous amount of people. Bordeaux, again, was a big city, but there was only 100,000 people there. They ended up transporting 150,000 enslaved Africans to the New World. So you understand that people are, and also there was usually 400 or between 200 and 400 Africans in Bordeaux at any time. These were enslaved Africans walking around. So the discussion about Africa was taking place in cafes and scientific institutions, and it was also taking place in the street because people are seeing this. Travel writing replaces religion as the most important form of literature. So until the 1720s, 1730s, people are reading religious texts if they read at all. 1740s, travel writing becomes an enormous, successful publication kind of area. And so by that time, people are reading more and more, and people are getting more and more interested in this. One of the most scary things I saw was by the 1760s, I was looking at women's magazines as women became far more literate, and also books for children. They were essentially primers for teaching racism. It's one of the most terrifying things I discovered writing my last book, that essentially there was this education process with almost a catechism of racism. You would read a question like, what are Africans like? And then there'd be a huge kind of paragraph which children were forced to recite. So it's very much like what would happen at church too. So it's interesting to look at how this was this taking place in almost all different areas.
Skip, I wondered, we have this first question, which is sort of the seminal question of the book, right? The first question from one of our attendees is, was Blackness invented?
Yes, of course. Blackness is a metaphor because, as we said, there's nobody who's Black, right? It was ascribed that we are people of African descent are a rainbow coalition of browns, from dark browns, medium browns, copper browns, reddish browns. We are all kind of brown people on the African continent, but nobody is Black. So it was just like whiteness is an invention, so is Blackness in contradistinction to whiteness. That's the great binary opposition. And it ties into notions of good and evil as old as the Middle Ages, that Satan was Black, that representations of the devil as Black is one of the things we talk about in our volumes, The Image of the Black in Western Art, from early on in the Christian tradition. And in other traditions too. So this is all grafted onto Black people. They're dark, so they become Black. And then you have this whole set of imagery that relates everything Black to being everything bad, everything dark, satanic, evil, unfortunate, bad omen, a series of connotations that's never ending, and out of which Black people are still struggling to emerge. And as I said, so striking was the color that is what was used to name people. Someone sent a chat thing saying, what were Black people called? They were called Black people. Zanzibar means land of the Blacks. Sudan means land of the Blacks. Ethiopian means land of the burnt face, which is kind of another way of saying land of the Blacks. The exception was Guinea, which was widely used in the 17th and 18th century. But that didn't refer to the color of the people in West Africa. But these terms were, people talk about Ethiopians for all Black, not just people from what we today term as Ethiopia. The Sudan was not just the country, big as it is, under Egypt, right, along the Nile, it was for the Western Sudan went all the way across the equator. So that, again, it was the color of the skin of the Africans, which was the most striking thing that, excuse me, that Europeans noticed about people on the continent.
So here's the companion question from another attendee who says, when was white invented?
Andy?
Well, I think that's the Nell Painter question, isn't it? So who wrote the
Yeah,
great book on the
exactly.
invention of whiteness. These things do happen kind of at the same time, clearly. I mean, and Kant is one of the people who is one of the primary kind of people who created, a whole set of characters to go along with color. So each people were being sorted by color and so on and so forth. So you could also go back to Bernier in some ways. Bernier created a huge category for whiteness it had lots of different kind of hues and so on and so forth as kind of a category. And so I think the history of classification is something to think about. Classification runs kind of parallel for a long time to a lot of things we're talking about tonight. So, and it's actually slow to take off. Bernier, as Skip said, was 1684. And then we have Linnaeus in 1735. Mm-hmm. He also talks about the African in Niger and, the European as white. He associates geography with whiteness, African with blackness as a kind of a category. He didn't go into liabilities at that point. By 1758, he associates whiteness and blackness with humoral tendencies. So at that point, he started to associate the inside of bodies with the outside. I mean, race is something that takes place on the inside as well as the outside. We've talked about, pigmentation and skin a lot, but as soon as the anatomists and the classifiers take over, they kind of bring it together, and then race goes inside the body as something that is internal. Skip also mentioned the idea of bile and black brains. When the real horrifying racism of the 18th and 19th century takes off, anatomists are dissecting African cadavers and looking for specific anatomical features, which they then hand off to the classifiers in order to come up with even more trenchant categories and terrible things. So
yeah, I want to. Celeste, no, just a minute, because I'll lose this point. Thomas Jefferson.
That's exactly where I was going. That's exactly where I was going.
This is what Jefferson says about whiteness. He says, this is in his book, Ladies and Gentlemen, Notes on the State of Virginia, where he trashes Phyllis Wheatley, among other things. But he says, the first difference between Black people and white people, which strikes us, is that of color. Whether the Black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and the scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature and is as real as if its seed and cause were better known to us. Now, listen to this. And that was like he'd done a summation of the essay submitted to the Bordeaux Academy. Then he continues, and is this difference of color of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white, the expressions of every passion by greater or less suffusions of color in the one, preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black, which covers all the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair a more elegant symmetry of form. Their own judgment, meaning the Black people, favor whites, declared by their preference for them, as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for Black women on the African continent over their own species. Now, I hope that everybody understood that Thomas Jefferson just said that African women were sleeping with male orangutans, and you would presume vice versa. That is one of the nastiest things in a whole, we could fill up Yankee Stadium with racist things the Europeans say about Africans in the 18th century. But that is one of the most pernicious. That you were sleeping with monkeys?
Which leads me to my next question, because, and this also an attendee question, because they want to know about the impact, not just these essays, but these ideas have on later history. You say that number one, a lot of the things that people claim, in fact, pretty much everything that people claim causes blackness in these essays is just wrong. They said their blood was reddish black, that their brains were blue, that black fluid coursed from their brain throughout their body, that black people who would move to France would get lighter. I mean, very
Right.
easily disproved things. Which you said in the book, these explanations were completely spurious is not important, and that leads me to the fact of why not? Was it because these ideas were believed? Why is the fact that they were incorrect? Why doesn't that matter, Andy?
Yeah, well, that's a big question from a very smart attendee tonight. But I think it's interesting to look at how these things start taking shape more politically in the 1770s. If people buy the book, they'll see there's a second essay contest, a second prize puzzle of 1772. In 1741, despite the fact that Bordeaux is bathing in the benefits of both slavery and its relationship with the Caribbean, the essay contest itself is constructed kind of an apolitical kind of way. There's no mention of slavery. By 1772, they can't avoid it anymore because attitudes are shifting. In fact, by 1770, there's this famous book that comes out called The History of the Two Indies, which is the first kind of indictment of colonial expansion. And people are starting to really think about the slave trade as a bad thing. And all the philosophes are getting involved with this whole thing. What does that do to the racism? The racism is kind of floating around by itself. It hasn't been deployed politically because there was no need to do so, because the slave trade justified itself. And there's a number of justifications for the slave trade, or people just didn't care. As soon as that comes under fire, what happens is a huge pro-slavery lobby is going to grab hold of all of these ideas and deploy them in a way that's incredibly effective. And this happens in the French, English, and American context. And it's funny to kind of see that, these racist ideas were kind of contained in natural history. And then the planters talked about it a little bit in their travel logs. But by the 1770s, you're seeing it, used much more effectively. As soon as slavery comes under fire, they were able to trot out just a litany of terrible things: black brains, small intelligence, really, or else separate race, separate species. And if you have separate species, separate kind of physiology, you have a separate kind of political reality for that group of people. So that's really
absolutely. And the key thing is that nature did it. Nature made these people. Well, one, these people are deficient. They're deficient in one of these ways, right? And their difference from us Europeans signifies the fact that they are a lower order of being, right? And that difference, whatever the difference is, that's what we mean by it doesn't really matter which of these interpretations, because they all were attempts to say that these people were that blackness was an affliction, and it had been afflicted, as it were, by nature or God or biology, the capital N, capital G, or capital B. If something is fixed by nature, by biology, or by God, nothing you can do can change it. And that these people are therefore worthy, designed, suited to be, ideally suited to be slaves, property, that they are not like us, that they are different. And why was that important to justify? The richest colony in the history of the world was the island that in 1804 became Haiti. It was called Saint-Domingue. It was the richest colony in the history of the world at the time because of the 5-letter word, begins with S, called sugar. And sugar, until the New World opened up, only rich people could, as the song said, kings and queens and bishops too, only really rich people could taste sugar. Now you remember, everybody listening, remember the first time you see a little kid lick an ice cream cone, their eyes go across, you get that rush, that sugar rush. Imagine a whole culture. England built the culture around 4:00, tea with and crumpets, sugar cakes, sugar in your tea, the whole country comes to a stop. None of that happened before the New World opened up. And this made some people fabulously rich, including the Empire of France, because they were growing sugar in the Caribbean until the Black people on the island of Saint Domingue said, no more. This is a new kid in town, a new game, and his name is Toussaint Louverture, and then Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Finally put the lights out on Napoleon's army with the help of yellow fever.
But we've kind of been punishing Haiti ever since.
Oh my God, it's terrible. Starting with Thomas Jefferson. And then I think it was in 1825 when France finally agreed to acknowledge nobody in the world community would acknowledge that Haiti was a country. And there are things that you can't do as a country if nobody acts like you're a country, right? And so Haiti, in a bad economic deal, agreed to pay France reparations. Now, when do you ever hear of the victor paying reparations, right? They paid France reparations, and you could Google this, but I think they were still paying France reparations until 1948 or something. Yeah. I mean, it's just incredible. And the Americans, Lincoln only accepted the ambassador from Haiti during the Civil War. What's that about? And that was in 1862, right before the Emancipation Proclamation, when he allowed Black men to be armed and therefore able to be in combat with white men. That was part of the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln later said that he only won the war because of what he called his Black warriors, the 200,000 Black men who served in the Army and the Navy and who played a pivotal role in the Union's victory over the Confederacy. So it's no accident that he allowed the Haitian ambassador, I'm saying, to come at the time. And it's no accident that this essay competition arises just as the slave trade is starting to grow, as the Enlightenment is reaching its apex.
Well, I'm glad you've given me another great transition to a question, because from your work, from Ibram X. Kendi's work, from the 1419 Project, there's been a broader understanding of Blackness as an invention that was used to justify slavery. And one of our attendees says, "My parents taught me that man will always try to oppress that which he believes is greater than him. Do you believe the movement to oppress Blackness is related to having knowledge or suspicion of the greatness of the African continent and her people, or was it purely for economic reasons to justify the enslavement of humans?"
And do you want that?
Yeah, I think that, there's those, I call those kind of aphoristic history, and I think that, we can answer that a lot of different ways. One of the things that contradicts that in some ways is another aphorism or big kind of saying I've kept in my mind, and that is, humanity ends at the frontiers of one's own tribe too. So that's the idea that different ethnicities, no matter who they are, wherever they are going to enter into conflict and oppress each other. Certainly, I think that, our own work, points to a pretty clear genealogy, which is linked to economic exploitation, as opposed to some kind of huge psychological paradigm, which means that meant that Europeans were afraid of Africans or something like that. So I think that, talking about gigantic psychological, psychologies, national psychologies, continent-wide psychologies is reductive both on one continent and also on the other. I think that, if in this book, I mean, it's an interesting kind of slice of vertical history, because we get to see what people are thinking in 1741, and we've also constructed it in a horizontal way, so you really get an idea of the overall history of race from beginning until the late 18th, early 19th century. And so I think that's a kind of a better way of looking at that, at least from my point of view. Skip?
I agree. There were different times. The history of the relationship between what we now call Europe in its various parts and what we now call Africa wasn't always one-sided and wasn't always negative. The whole action of the Iliad takes place with the Greek gods celebrating with the ancient Ethiopians, because the Greek gods, Zeus and his children, preferred the sacrifices of the Ethiopians, right? Then, if you Google who was the richest man in the world, it was Mansa Musa, according to networth.com, who is worth, according to networth.com, $400 billion. Watch out, Elon. Move over, Elon. And Mansa Musa made the pilgrimage to Mecca between 1325 and 1327. I think you can fact check me on that. And he had so much gold. Europe got its gold at various points from in the history of Europe from different parts in Africa. Egypt got its gold from Nubia, the kingdom of Kush, and that's today's Sudan. Different European at different times, gold came from what is now Zimbabwe, and gold came from north of Timbuktu. And Mansa Musa was the emperor of Mali, where Timbuktu is. He had so much gold, Celeste, that when he got to Cairo, he was just giving away like popcorn. And it depressed the gold market for a decade, I think. This brother was bad. The king of Congo converted willingly to Roman Catholicism in 1491. He sent his son, and he converted the kingdom, of course, sent his son to Europe, and he was returned in 1517, I believe, as the first African bishop in the Roman Catholic Church from West Africa. And early Christianity was sustained throughout North Africa and in Nubia, which again is the kingdom of Kush, this area in Sudan. And so the early church fathers had a lot of interaction with Africans, and there was a steady flow of Ethiopian pilgrims back and forth to Jerusalem. And we know that in the New Testament that the Queen of Meroe, which is a successor kingdom of the kingdom of Kush and Nubia, sent her treasurer to Jerusalem, and he's in the New Testament, which is why so many Black Episcopal churches were called St. Philip's Church, because that was the part of the Bible where this Black man shows up. And that was as close to Blackness as we could get. But these are real interactions, and they weren't hostile interactions. They were neutral interactions. Everything changed with the slave trade. It's not to say that there wasn't some manifestation of anti-Black racism in the history of the West, because there are examples of that. White Over Black is the best account by Winthrop Jordan of the image of Blackness in the Western imagination. But if you want to see the visual record, look at David Bindman and Henry Louis Gates's edited Image of the Black in Western Art volumes, where we show how Europeans, starting with the Greeks and the Romans, represented Black people, real African descended people in their art. And they were clearly fascinated by the physical differences between white people and Black people. So in sum, it's okay to be fascinated by difference, but it's when you doom someone to be at a lower scale on the great chain of being, when you doom them to be, are they really human beings? Are they really at the bottom of the human community or top of the animal kingdom? Are they mating with apes down there at the equator? That's some pernicious stuff. They ruled our ancestors out of the human community. And then if you rule them out of the human community, you're doing them a favor if you enslave them.
I want to make a note for attendees. There are a lot of questions about lots and lots of different things. Other races, Asia, phrenology, the pseudoscience. I'm trying, because we are short on time, we only have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to keep questions pretty much focused on what's within the book. For example, there is a good question about Darwin, but the Origin of the Species came out more than 100 years later. So we're going to try to stay narrowly focused on what was within the book. There was one question from
Tell these people in the chat to click on buy the book.
There you go.
There is 1,000 questions. Just buy the book.
So Tanya asks, were these essays widely distributed and published? Which I think is a good question. What happened to these essays, and how did they get lost for 300 years?
No, when they met in 1741, they said they didn't know what the cause of Blackness was, but they knew what it wasn't, as we say in the introduction. And they knew none of these 16 essays had gotten it right. So they didn't give a prize. They were in the library at the Academy of Bordeaux, and then they went into the archives of the city of Bordeaux, and where they sat for all these years. So they were never published, though one of the essayists, the 16th essayist, did publish his essay on his own. And he said that he was encouraged to do that by the academicians. And when I read that quote from Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson is repeating an argument that essayist made in his submission. So no, that's the point. They just sat there for almost 300 years. A handful of scholars mention them in their footnotes. Andy, how many references did you find from previous scholars who had written about these essays?
Really, not many. Maybe two.
No, a handful.
Maybe. So yeah, I think I could pick up on that whole question here, and even nod to the Darwin question. Because what is happening here really is a seismic shift from the biblical understanding of humankind to a more scientific, pseudoscientific understanding of humankind. And one of the things, Skip described this as kind of an overall pathology of the African that's happening, is that specifically when it came to this idea of degeneration theory, which is the most important scientific paradigm to come out of the 1740s. And this is the idea that there's a white prototype race that degenerates in different climates. And what it does is it reduces humankind, which was this sacred thing, separate from the animal kingdom. Humans were not part of the animal kingdom really until 1735, when Linnaeus says, guess what? They're part of the animal kingdom. And this was a huge thing. People freaked out when this happened. In the 1740s, people are saying, okay, we can accept that. And then when they start looking at humankind in terms of the story, when nature starts having a history, they put humankind in this big chronicle. And in this chronicle, what happens is that Africans and people of other groups are seen as accidents, human accidents. It's nature and its determinants which change these people. Now, that could
from
be
their original whiteness.
From their original whiteness. And then, when they first played with this, it was actually a very kind of flexible idea. Some people said, you can move back and forth. If a family of white people goes to Africa after 300 years, they may turn black. And then if the black family comes to England or Norway, 300 years, they turn white. So that this is really kind of not really very racialized. But after, by the 1760s, people say, no way, this is it's a one-way street. Degeneration is a one-way street. You cannot come back. And that's one of the things that happens. And so this idea.
No, Andy, to paraphrase a favorite line that Black people use, how would you say? If you're Black, you can't come back.
That's not quite how that one goes.
But super fast, what happens is that the idea of human accident goes off to Darwin. That's the idea that nature can have a history. And so that's very important to think about the 1740s as giving rise to that possibility later on in the 19th century.
So we have 7 minutes left. So I want us to get to sort of a takeaway for those who are here. And I wanted to give you both a chance to reflect on what we actually learned from these essays. Looking back over the history that comes, we've had a couple questions about what do these essays tell us about whether or not Europe came around on slavery, or why they came around on slavery sooner than the United States, for example, why by the 20th century Black Americans were fleeing to Europe in order to have a better chance in their careers, Josephine Baker, Langston Hughes, etc., Paul Robeson, etc., etc., etc. So what do we learn in terms of what came after from these essays? Any inkling of how the evolution of the views of race was to happen?
The first takeaway is that ideas don't unfold in a vacuum. And let me repeat that. Ideas don't unfold in a vacuum, that they are related through phases of mediation they were related to economic reality, social reality, political reality. So though none of those 40 academicians talked about slavery in this competition, this is all about slavery. It's all about justifying this perverse institution that actually tried to turn women and men into property, into chattel property. So then it makes you hope that we ourselves will be humble enough to say, where do our ideas come from? What larger social, political, economic institutions are our beliefs reflecting and we're not aware of, right? What will future generations, how will they look back and judge us? And what will they judge us as? They'll say, how could these stupid idiots have, I don't know, treated chickens in the way that we treat, the horrendous way that we raise chickens and slaughter them and then, eat them? Or animals, like how we slaughtered animals before we killed them. Who knows? But it makes you humble and it makes you think, we really need to take it easy and do a lot of self-reflection and self-examination about the things we think about trans people, the things we think about the stranger of color, the origins of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Asian thinking, anti-trans thinking. What work is being done when people engage in Islamophobia? What work is being done when people try to regulate the sexual choices that people make? I mean, their gender choices over their own body. What work is being done by sexism, and what work is continuing to be done by anti-Black racism? That's what we hope that this book is a contribution to, in part.
If I could add just a couple of words to that really brilliant summary of kind of what we were trying to do here over. I would say that the book is a little different from what is out there right now, and that there are a lot of books about the history of slavery and history of racism on an institutional level, and this is really a book about the history of race and where it came from. And that's different, and it's very hard to confront a lot of the terminology, the ideas in a kind of a brutal way sometimes. And a quick anecdote, I taught a class in a prison program this past fall on histories of race, where I test drove the book that Skip and I did. And this drew about 80% of the students were students of color who were attracted by the idea of figuring out where race came from. At the end of the semester, I was talking to the whole class about what this meant. And one of the students was very moved by the whole thing. He said he wasn't sure what he would confront here, and it was hard. But paradoxically, it was quite emancipatory, because he looked back in time and said, it's all bullshit, in his words, it's all bullshit. He just wanted to figure out where it all came from, and understanding that genealogy, the pernicious genealogy, actually helped him in a certain way. He felt like his life had been determined by this on a certain level. It was an incredibly moving moment. So I think one of the things about the history of race, which we don't study that much, is that it could be an essential kind of component in the overall rethinking of who we are, as Skip was saying.
Okay, so I'm going to leave 1 minute for politics and prose to wrap up, but Skip, I got to ask you, you both have written yet another book that might be banned at this moment.
Well, to my amazement, I did a book that's just a chronology of events affecting African American people, right? People of African descent in the New World. It was just banned in Texas. It's a chronology, for goodness sake. I just think people saw the title and my name and just banned it. I don't think they read it, and they need to do better than that. They could ban one of my better books. But let me say to everybody, censorship is to knowledge. Censorship is to art, as lynching is to justice. And these people are lynching the truth, the expression of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth. We have, no matter if you're on the left or the right, we have to stand up and fight for the right of every qualified American to vote, and of every student to be taught the full range of interpretations of American and world history. And not to do that is to undermine the very premise of what an education is all about, and is to reinscribe racism, frankly, into the education system.
Okay, so we'll end on that mic drop. Thank you so much, Professor
Celeste,
Gates and
you're
Professor Curran.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was excellent.
I first want to say thank you all so much for taking the time to be here tonight and for such an incredible conversation. I really appreciated it, and I know that the audience did too. I'd also like to thank the audience here today, as your patronage is really what allows us to bring you programming like this, and we would not be able to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Professor Gates and Professor Curran and Politics and Prose by using the link that we've posted a few times throughout the chat to purchase Who's Black and Why directly through our website. And be sure to keep an eye on our website for current event listings, as we have plenty of excellent events to attend virtually and now also in person. So hope to see you there. Thank you again, Henry, Andrew, and Celeste, for joining us today. Keep well read, everyone, and have a great rest of your night.
Night.
Thank you. Have a great